Hello, and welcome to Facilitating XYZ Live. I am Sam Killermann. I'm with Meg Bolger and Eric Boggs, who will introduce themselves in a minute. This is a show where we talk with facilitators about all things facilitation, and it's Meg and my goal or our objective to take the learning from different fields of facilitation and apply it to our own work, and hopefully anybody who's tuning in live's work as well. I'm really excited about today's episode and conversation. And before we get into that, I just want to make a brief announcement, something that Meg and I are really excited about. About a year ago, we started the process of what would eventually become Facilitating XYZ. And it was an idea that we had in our minds and something that we were really excited about, but we didn't quite know what shape it would take or how the world would respond. And we moved forward with a Kickstarter about 7 or 8 months ago. Yeah, Meg? Trying to think of when that was. Yeah, last fall. And the Kickstarter, it proved to be less helpful than we realized because what we were communicating was not what was being received, and it put us back to the drawing board of trying to realize what would Facilitating XYZ be, how could we create a resource that was beneficial for all facilitators and be free and be easily accessible online, and a lot of other little goals that we had. And ultimately, how could we create a community of facilitators to learn from one another, to find support from one another, and so on. This project, the Facilitating XYZ live interviews, is something that was a byproduct of that, and a lot of other things that Meg and I have been working on. And we're excited to announce that within the next month or two, so relatively soon from now, we will be launching the first version of Facilitating XYZ. And it's going to have resources, it's going to have some helpful videos. A lot of the excerpts from these conversations that we've been having will be put up on that website, and some other things. So if you're a facilitator or if you're somebody who's looking for support in your facilitation, that'll be a great resource for you, and it'll include downloadable chapters of our books and other things beyond just the stuff that we create directly for that resource. If you want to check that out, it's at facilitating.xyz, that's the website, and there's a mailing list on that website right now where you can sign up and be one of the first people to find out when we actually do go live. So I'm excited about that, as just a little announcement. And with that said, I'll introduce myself, which I guess I should have done already. I'm Sam. I am one of the co-creators of the Safe Zone Project with Meg, co-author of Unlocking the Magic of Facilitation, also with Meg. I've written a lot about gender and sexuality, and most of the facilitation I do is in the realm of social justice. And I am excited for this conversation because, as I've mentioned a few times online, I am not an experiential educator, and I never have been, but I've always envied what experiential educators are able to do, and it's something that I'm excited to talk to Eric about. Meg?
Yeah, hello everyone. I am Meg, and the other half of some of the co-creation projects that Sam mentioned. I've also been kind of on the outskirts of the experiential education world for a while, and it has my heart, even if it does not have my job description for a lot of different times. And that is where I connected with Eric at first at the Association of Experiential Educators, or AEE, to help all of us not get bogged down with that mouthful. So I'm really
bogged down.
That's why co-facilitation is so important, because I wasn't going to make that joke. But I'm really excited to kick it off to Eric and just ask Eric to kind of give us an intro. Tell us who you are.
Cool. Hi, I'm Eric Boggs. I have a couple different job titles, and I occupy a couple different identities. I am the Assistant Director for Experiential Learning at the University of Oregon's Holden Center for Leadership and Community Engagement. My business card is like the size of a check. I have joined higher ed in the last 4 years working in student affairs, which is a pretty cool niche for me. I primarily focus on experiential learning programs, which is to say they're co-curricular and they're not associated with credit, and students do them for the life experience, the leadership experience, service learning experience, etc. Prior to that, I was a high school teacher and for 3 or 4 years with an outdoor high school, which was kind of a cool blend of my previous life, which I occasionally dip into, which is working with the National Outdoor Leadership School as faculty on expeditions that are from 2 weeks to 3 months long in the wilderness of Mexico or Patagonia or Alaska, where we hope to build leadership skills. So that's me. I'm here in Eugene, and I'm stoked to be on this show. This is my first Google Hangout interview, and I'm excited to meet Sam via the internet and see Meg again. It's been a little while since AE.
Eric, can you tell anybody who's tuning in what is experiential education? Because I think that's something that a lot of people may have had an experience with or touched on a little bit, but maybe not have a really clear understanding of what is meant by that moniker.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are still trying to figure out what that is. Experiential education or experiential learning can be assigned to a lot of different types of learning. So learning by doing is the easy to tag on cliche. Learning by doing, and so some folks use experiential learning to describe learning in an internship in a job shadowing program. Right? Some people think of being an apprentice as experiential learning, and I think those definitely are experiential learning. My field or my niche is specifically around well-scaffolded experiences that take students generally out of their comfort zones and challenge them, either with a community engagement project or a challenge course, like a ropes course, or in the case of NOLS, an outdoor expedition, push them out of their comfort zones and then encourage them to learn through this pedagogy, which is to experience, then to reflect, and then to apply. So what, now what, right? And so a lot of our experiences, it's not enough just to do the thing. We also have to make space to make that meaning and reflect on what's happened.
You mentioned well scaffolded, and I don't know if that was what Meg was going to jump on, but that's the thing that Meg and I talk about a lot is scaffolding an experience to make it so that most effective, so someone can learn from that experience, or that it doesn't result in like harm, but does result in positive growth. Yeah. I'm wondering what goes into, so for us when we talk about that, it's in a classroom most of the time. You know, it's in a very contained, physically safe environment. I'm curious what goes into the scaffolding, so to speak, when you're doing an outdoor program that might have both physical and emotional and psychological risk.
Yeah, there's a lot there. Which one should I jump on? I think most people think of the physical risk when they think of the outdoors. You know, they think of the wilderness as being a wild and dangerous place. That's the name. And so training is essential. You know, training is essential. And NOLS and most other folks like Outward Bound, wilderness first aid, wilderness first responder training, and practice dealing with medical emergencies is an industry standard prior to even interviewing to become an instructor. And then most organizations have well-organized trainings that teach their instructors how to facilitate an evacuation should there be an emergency, or how to deal with something that may not be life-threatening but is dangerous. So that type of risk is really well managed down to there's a whole conference that's called the Wilderness Risk Management Conference that I attended as well, and it's just about what are those best practices. NOLS has accepted field practices from bear camping to river crossing to make sure that folks are doing it really well. But ultimately, that foundation for kind of physical safety is now really being applied, I think, more and more to social and emotional learning. Both in terms of anti-bullying curriculum, but also in terms of using gender-inclusive pronouns and making sure that this is a space that everybody feels like they can step into and challenge themselves, but also feel like it's a positive learning environment. And just as it wouldn't be safe, you wouldn't feel safe if you didn't feel like your instructors were managing, rock fall on a slope. You want to feel like your instructors are helping manage the group dynamics and call people out or call people in if you feel like this the learning environment has become oppressive. Yeah.
Something I know from, or like something we talked about in an earlier conversation between us, Eric, was that you sometimes play the role of a meta facilitator in the sense that you are facilitating facilitators, and like you do that. And I also know that you do you have taught wilderness first aid. And so, I'm like thinking in the ways that you've talked about this of like, what are the things that you try to prepare facilitators with, like to to give them that like social and or emotional awareness that you're like, okay, like this is how you deal with blisters on the trail. This is how you deal with like homesickness or like whatever it is, the social emotional stuff that comes up. Like, do you have any things that come to mind of like I tend to try to focus on these things when giving new facilitators some social emotional kind of prep?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a lot easier to teach somebody how to repair a blister or treat one than it is to teach somebody how to mend group dynamics that have gone awry. Right? I think the biggest thing that we're trying to get into here at the Holden Center is mindset training, as opposed to a particular procedure or protocol. And so we've been using this frame. My colleague Chris and I presented it at AE. Actually, it's called "Let Go, Notice More, Use Everything," and it's riffs from the improv world where he has a background. But really trying to get people into this kind of playful and adaptable space where they know the shape of what they're trying to do, but how it exactly happens. Why? It's kind of like, why bother establishing that? Let's first get people used to this flexibility, this ambiguity, tolerance for uncertainty, and train them to thrive in that space as opposed to panic in that space.
What a fascinating frame. I'd love to hear more about that. And before that, though, I'm curious, that just popped into my mind, this question. So you're just talking about bringing something from improv into experiential ed, right? Mm-hmm. What would be something that folks outside of experiential ed could bring from experiential education into their work, into their education, their facilitation, their training? What is something that y'all do really well beyond, well, actually, I mean, it could just be some of the things we've already talked about, but what would be something that you wish everybody would do that y'all do really well?
Yeah, I think experiential educators by trade are adaptable. It's hard to last long in this field if you feel like things are going wrong, if your plan changes, right? We're used to planning for contingencies and contingencies on those contingencies, and so sometimes I wish that the world could be as adaptable as experiential educators. Like, okay, well, this happened, so it's not really a question of that happened. It's a question of what we should do next, and so let's keep rolling with it.
That picture that we were using to promote this conversation, like the U in front of the mountain, in front of the lake with the big old post-it writing on it is a good example of that, I think, that adaptability, where some facilitators would say, I need a whiteboard, or I need, like, these are things that Meg and I yell at all the time, we need 3 stands for our post-its, or whatever. I'm just loving that, like, there's like wind blowing in your face as you're writing on that sheet. I'm wondering how would you teach that to somebody? How would you teach that mindset of, let go of the questions you were just saying of like, why is this happening, or this shouldn't be happening, and just do we've got this and we're going to roll with it? Like, how would you help somebody get to that place where they can be adaptable instead of being attached to what they wish they had or what they wish hadn't happened?
Yeah, I think that's the essence of the work. And every party has its own pathology, so we need a different pedagogy, right? One of the things that I love about teaching first aid for WMI, Wellness Medicine Institute, is that we have a pretty routinized, mechanized system for teaching what's called the patient assessment system. So we start off like, survey the scene, I'm number 1, like, and we're establishing all these things through kinesthetic learning and also didactic, repeat after me stuff. And at the end of the first 3 hours, people have embedded in them an approach, a mindset to approach a first aid situation. One of the reasons that I love to teach for WMI is that that pedagogy is effective. It sticks with people, and so if they see a car crash or if they're in an avalanche, they're going to be doing the survey the scene motor memory thing that we did there, right? And so that's a really compressed, that's like an 18-hour course. But depending on the experience, I think establishing this adaptability, this flexibility, this mindset work takes a lot. It takes modeling by professional staff. It takes modeling, hopefully, by people who are in designated leadership roles. Meg spoke of meta facilitation, and so I have student leaders, designated kind of team managers who are in the like group organizers, and so hopefully they're showing it as well. But it also takes pointing out and reflecting on it and giving people props and giving people praise for showing up in a way that maybe it was just authentic to them and they didn't think twice. You know, it's not about them standing up there and like, I'm resilient. It was just more how they showed up in the situation. And by calling attention to that in a debrief or just on the side, I think that can really help a group understand what its norms are. So that's on experience. I think to rewind for a second, something that we try to do in terms of the story of us, the story of our group, we try to script it ahead of time, and so that in our community agreement or our pre-departure meetings, we really frame clearly what the experience is going to be like, but state these things as community goals, so that people know that that this is something that's going to happen. One of our partners in Nicaragua has a little mantra that's, Nicaragua requires us to be patient, and she requires us to be flexible, and she requires us to be adaptable. And so we kind of chant, you know, like, repeat after me when the bus is broken down, or you showed up to the health clinic, or whatever. And so having that pre-framing, I think, really helps people organize their experience into something that that they expected or could expect as a learning norm. Yeah.
And how counterintuitive is that to most management principles? Like, I think that so many managers or so many meetings that you might have with a supervisor or with a supervisee, you reward things that went to plan, you reward good planning, you reward good execution of those plans,
Right.
And oftentimes I think the debrief would be, oh, that thing didn't go how we were expecting. How can we prevent that unexpected thing from happening again in the future? Instead of, how can we celebrate the fact that that unexpected thing happened and we handled it really well? Or how can we prepare ourselves more to handle unexpected things or to create opportunities for unexpected things to happen, instead of how can we meticulously plan everything? And it's interesting because I don't think many people in that debrief would see that as a positive. Like, I love the mantra too. Huh, that's interesting.
Yeah, well, I think we're trained to be to work that way. You know, it's almost kind of the Industrial Revolution's model for education, that you plan your product, and your product is your experience, and so if the product is off, then clearly there's a problem in production. There's just an article on HBR and Harvard Business Review this morning. I think I retweeted it or something. It's on dynamic equilibrium, and kind of that balance of of management with that in mind, and how it's essential for effective managers to be able to do that, but also can be complicated in terms of how do you plan for the future if you're so flexible.
Yeah, interesting. I'm definitely going to read that. We'll retweet it on the FacilitatingXYZ or Safe Zone Project Twitter as well.
Yeah. One thing that I love, though, about the, to me, it just strikes me as this amazing paradox, right? Of what we were saying about the Nicaragua trip is you said the unexpected is going to happen, be flexible, and something's not going to work out. And
right.
So by saying that, you meet those expectations every
It's
right?
brilliant.
What's that?
It's brilliant, right?
Yeah. Somebody it's setting up expectations that you are nailing it when the bus breaks down, right? You're like, what did we say? And everybody's like, flexible, and you're like, yeah, and all becomes this thing that was expected,
right.
And so you still are meeting those goals. And so what's so interesting to me is the idea of me and Sam do it in our work when we say so this conversation is going to be hard and probably kind of uncomfortable at some point. And then when people feel discomfort, they're not like, something's going wrong. They're like, they said this is going to happen, and it's happening. And
right.
named it up front, it becomes something that feels less threatening, I think. And I was just I wanted to kind of highlight that. To me, that's part of where we started of this scaffolding, is
right.
you say things right up front that will change the experience, the whole experience, just by naming them as present or probable.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the story. Sorry, go ahead. The stories that we tell ourselves about our experiences actually impact the experiences, right? And so if, as facilitators, we can be mindful of what some of those bigger themes or narratives are, it's really important, I think, to the lived experience of the participants. One of my grand ventures into the field of experiential learning was a 3-month-long semester in Patagonia in 1999 when I was 19. and I approached it in this like super meat-headed way. I was a recovering football player and lacrosse player, and I was like, I'm gonna go to Patagonia and I'm gonna like ice climb and it's gonna be badass and I'm gonna do all this stuff. And it was badass, but it was not badass in the way that I thought it was gonna be. You know, I didn't get to ice climb for more than 3 hours, but we had food shortages and windstorms that broke tents and people getting evacuated for broken feet, and it was kind of like, you can't. What I lifted from that was if you could pick your challenge, it wouldn't really be that much of a challenge, right? So my challenge was like from the drop-down menu. I want to become an ice climber. I'm going to look like that catalog in Patagonia or whatever. Not my challenge at all, which I think is what worries people about experiential learning, or people get skittish about, is that it's pretty hard to choose one specific learning objective that they're going to get. You know, I think we exist in a kind of consumeristic world when it comes to educational experiences, and we can fool ourselves pretty easily about what we hope to take away from one particular thing. And experiential education, sometimes it's hard to know. We control a lot, we manage well, but ultimately what the most significant learning impacts are, it's kind of up to the iteration.
How do you push back against people who are asking for that? How do you push back when an administrator or a programmer, whomever it might be that you're saying, really wants there to be a specific, measurable outcome that you can predict? How do you push back and say, we may not be able to have that much control, and that's not reason for not doing this? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
How do you do that?
I mean, real-world preparedness, I think, is a big mantra for us. You know, of this is how
more general outcome, you mean?
Well, no, like yeah, that could be an outcome, but we have learning outcomes that we establish for our, from the alternative break program, which is a community engagement program, so kind of service learning but without so much academic influence, in which we have a variety of learning objectives that we assess pre and post and measure outcomes. And it's interesting to see, after looking over all the course paperwork, what outcomes were really people hit on and strongly, and then read back on kind of the course log and see, okay, well, I can see why cultural sensitivity was a big learning growth area for this group, because based on their debriefs and exposure they had with the community, and from what we know about the identities of the participants, I can see why that's a big growth. So sometimes I fear that experiential ed uses that, my previous statement, as an excuse not to assess. I think we can still learn a lot from assessment, and it's important to justify our work. There's a guy, Bill Heinrich, that's at MSU. He's another AE guy. He did Activate, same as Meg did about 2 or 3 years ago in not Denver, in Chattanooga. And he's works in assessment for Michigan State. He does a really good job of assessing these experiential learning in a way that most folks in student life would be proud.
Awesome. There's so many good resources. I threw on my headphones. Hopefully the connection is a little better. I'm coming a little more clearly through. One thing that I wanted to circle back to that we said earlier, and I think is such a major component both of like facilitation and of experiential education, is like the importance of debrief as an opportunity to bring attention to things, is I think like how you kind of mentioned it. And it sounds like you I barely need to say more. I just want to like throw it back over to you of like, I think some people don't give time or space to debrief. And I'd love to know like either what moves you about debrief, or like what you would share with those folks who are like, I just want to like do the activities and then like move on.
Yeah. Gosh, where to start? Debriefing can be hard. More in any context. In the office, when it's cold and you're in Arctic Scandinavia and it's late at night, even though it's still light outside.
I love how you just went from the most relatable example to the least relatable example. Like, you just jumped like this gulf.
Yeah.
You know, when you're in Scandinavia, you know those times.
In the office, or when you're fighting for your life.
So my commitment in the field is just to make space to make meaning. So to dedicate time to doing that and have that be known from the beginning that that's something that we're about. And when I say we, I mean the community that I'm working with, because different NOLS instructors, different U of O facilitators, different folks have their different ways. And some people say, you know what, we're good. And I think that's valid if people feel like they are exhausted or tired or hungry or angry or lonely or tired. You need to stop. And I also think that if you give too many caveats, too many exit points for people to not debrief, or too much hope that you're not going to have that evening meeting, then it's hard to get engagement. So I just, I start on the first night. It doesn't matter if we flew a red eye through Houston and it's 12 o'clock and it's balmy in Nicaragua. We're still going to do it. We're still going to make that space. And then that becomes a norm for that week. And so I think that tenacity is really important.
Yeah, such a good point about that. People will, if you create just a little bit of wiggle room, whatever it might be, people jump right on that. I've noticed that so many times in trainings.
Yeah.
I'm curious, Eric, the make space to make meaning, I like that as a quote. How much space do you make? Like, do you have a system in your mind of if we do an activity that's blank long, we're going to spend blank amount of time to make meaning from it, or do you just kind of, or I'll just leave it at that. How do you decide how much space you're going to make?
Yeah, I decided on the spot. I wish there was an algorithm. Maybe there's a ratio there, and we can figure it out together. But I'm not that mathematical. I rely a lot on my own dynamic resonance, like my ability to read the group and see where their energy is. And also, I have the power and privilege of being an exceptionally awkward person when I need to. And so, like, I own the awkward really hard. Like, I can just be silent for a long time, or I could start a conversation off with talking about my collection of Care Bears when I was a kid and just throw people off guard, and then all of a sudden they're pulled in and they didn't even know it. So I'll come at you a couple different ways. But yeah, it's really just about reading the group. I think it's also about preparation, and really preparing space is important. I think where you're sitting, how people are lined up, preparation in terms of feeling the feelings of the group, trying to think about what you're going to talk about and ways to draw people in. I also tend to be a little bit sneaky and plant seeds of reflection throughout the day. And on the bus ride, I'm priming people. I'm asking you a question about that and what you thought about that. And sometimes I'll draw that back in, or sometimes it'll just come out organically. But people think about the debrief as something that just happens at the end of the day sometimes, but in my facilitator mind, it's like we're always thinking about what the debrief is.
Can you tell us about a time that you weren't present enough with the group or you weren't preparing throughout the day or throughout the experience to where you had a hard time with that debrief? Like, you recognized that you weren't being mindful enough throughout the day, and does that make sense?
Yeah, I can think of a conversation that a group had where it was intended to be scripted, and it was for community norms, but we wanted to get deeper middle of the trip, and so the facilitators were doing an activity called diversity icebergs, and these were undergraduate students who had prepared their own work pretty well and then introduced it to the group really well. But what I hadn't been aware of on this particular experience, I'll blame it on my unconscious bias and privilege, but also my exhaustion, was that this group wasn't really ready to have that diversity icebergs conversation, that people are talking about their lived experience in a really intense way, and then other people are saying, well, my grandmother is Norwegian, so I kind of know what that's like, and people are just going at very different levels, and so it's kind of a 1 hour in, we had to stop and fix, use a first aid analogy, and back up and calling people in, and analyze.
What did that sound like?
What did that sound like? Like
the stop and fix. Sometimes I think.
No, it sounded like Eric sighing a little bit for too long, and then an elbow. It sounded like stepping in, saying, "Hey, I appreciate this conversation, and I appreciate people being willing to offer their information, and I want to maximize our time here together, and I need to be real with y'all. We're operating at a couple of different levels, and I think that we need to have kind of an awareness check and a vulnerability check about what we're offering. And it comes back to that kind of intent versus impact conundrum that I think can be a lot harder for students who come from privilege to see the lived experiences of students who don't have that privilege. And if it flies by, it has the intent. Can have the impact of doing great harm. And so that was one of those situations that we spoke of earlier. That would be the rock fall, where you're like, oh, this is like, we need to stay safe here.
Yeah.
That's such a good. I don't know if Meg, if this is what you're asking that, but I think so many people don't know how to stop the thing when it's gone out of control, so to speak. They see a facilitation as being kind of this unstoppable freight train, and once it's gone on its own track, you just have to watch and let it crash. And you just it was so graceful in the way that you just like modeled how you stopped that. And the thing that I noticed most was how many times you said the word "and" versus the word "but." You know, I really appreciate this conversation, and we need to do something different here, and this isn't what we were hoping to accomplish, and maybe we can still accomplish that. And all of those little ands added up in my mind to being like a really slow, like, we're going to take this train and get it back on its tracks, instead of like the dynamite explosion that could have stopped the train if you had thrown in a bunch of butts. So I just wanted to say I appreciated that. And also for anybody who, like for myself, it's something that I'm constantly learning how to do that, how to stop the facilitation that I'm noticing isn't going how even close we were expecting it or hoping it would go, and preventing it from doing more harm than good. It's something that is tough.
Yeah.
I think something you said, Eric, too, that I would love to dig into, because it's something for me when I started facilitating, I was like, ugh, people always said, like, you just have to read your group. And I was always like, what does that mean? Like, what does that look, how? I know how to read a book. I don't know how to read a group. Like, that seems like this, like, ethereal thing that, like, other people know how to do and I don't. And you even use a term I've never heard of before, but I immediately connected with, which is dynamic resonance. I was like, cool, that's a great way to, that's such a cool, fancy word for, like, I feel you guys are doing this kind of thing. So I would love you to, like, if you were to talk to Meg 8 years ago when everybody was telling Meg, like, you just need to read the group, and I was, like, freaking out about what that meant, how would you, like, help somebody who has no idea where to start with that? And if you can work in what dynamic resonance is, I would love that.
Gosh, where to start with that? Before I decided to become an extrovert, I was a really shy kid and a watcher of people, and spent a lot of time watching and watching and watching before I decided to weigh in. And so I think that's where some of that impulse or that desire comes from. I also can be aloof and brash and step on folks and put my foot in my mouth, and so that's, I think, the other part of where it comes from is doing repairs and like, oh no, see what had happened was I was just trying to be funny. From those two great binaries, this is where my accidental skill set comes from. I think if I were to give you advice, it would be doing perception checks with individuals in order to read the entire group. And the advantage of a lot of what we do as experiential educators is it tends to be a pretty small community, right? In my work, small community on an expedition setting, so somewhere around 20 people. So that gives you the time of the day to be like, hey, when you make like that face, is that like your thinking face, or is that like your upset face? And so just trying to do these perception checks of that, you know, I'm seeing you as this, is that right? And I can build kind of I can put all the puzzle pieces together when I have those little bits of information. The other thing that I try to do is, I don't know what we call it other than like vibe control. I like to have experiences where I know what we are feeling as a community, right? And so whether that's a game of yeehaw or boppity bop bop or something silly, or if you're just telling a story about, you know, your older siblings or whatever, experiences where it's like, okay, yeah, we're having fun, right? Yeah, okay, this is what's happening now. And so you can, from there you can kind of construct your meaning. And from there you can use those skills of perception to say, actually, I think what the group needs right now is a little bit, just tone it down a little bit. Or people aren't people are participating but in a perfunctory way, and so that's where I would use this dynamic resonance to see what the group is doing and then reflect that and then try to point it in a different, put that light in a different direction. So that might be a time to be vulnerable as a facilitator, especially when we're talking about interrupting oppression. It's like, hey, I messed up here. I set this conversation in the wrong way, and so that's me opening myself up a little bit, taking off my expert hat and saying, hey, I messed up, and I'm not afraid to say that's my bad, and we also need to do some work here.
Do you think it's more important for, or maybe this is a hard way to ask this question, but I'm just going to ask it this way. Do you think it's more important for a group to have an experience that they would say, that was a great experience, whatever that might be, fun or happy or moving or whatever it might be? Do you think it's more important for a group to say, that was a great experience, or for them to say, I learned a lot or I grew a lot, and I didn't, even if I didn't necessarily enjoy that experience? Does that question make sense?
I think so. Let me go with it and see if I get off track. For me, they're the same in that I think that it's easy as a facilitator to worry about successful outcomes and wanting people to have a good time. But that's like the facilitation equivalent of wanting to be popular versus wanting to be real, right?
Yeah, that's awesome.
I want to be liked. I want people to laugh at my jokes. I want people to go home and tell their friends that this was a cool trip and to sign up for another one. I want my colleagues to think I did well. And we also have to push back on this, like, everybody's going to be happy and comfortable. I think when people talk about having learned a lot in a way that's not a euphemism, that generally means that that was an interesting experience. It generally means that people were pushed, they were challenged, and as a result of that, they grew, right? If they're comfortable and fun and have fun and happy, it'll be a good experience, but it might be one that developmentally is a good time, but it's kind of perfunctory. It doesn't really strike at the heart of some of these deeper things.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I was hitting at, because I've seen a lot of facilitators who I think are either uncomfortable with discomfort, or they, maybe it's that first thing you mentioned, they just have this mentality of they can't get past this wanting to be popular or wanting to be affirmed by the group, and as a result, they don't push groups into discomfort, or they don't push back when a group says, you know, we're not going to do this because we're not enjoying it. They won't push back for the sake of the growth or whatever it might be. And it seems like from the nods, y'all maybe have experienced this as well. And I'm just wondering if you would have any advice for somebody who is maybe more in that mindset of they're not quite comfortable with discomfort, or they're not ready to be unpopular for the sake of creating a more powerful growth outcome. What advice would you have for that person?
Look at your learning objectives, whether they're on paper or in your mind's eye or in your heart. Like, what are you trying to get after? And if I'm doing a week-long kind of float and bloat kayak trip in Baja, and the objectives are to have a good time and tell jokes, then let's do that. But if the objectives are to unlearn racism or to work in community health and rural communities, you know, like those should be your guide. And so I think those for me are reassuring because, you know, again, I don't want people not to like me, but I need to know where I'm pushing from. Am I just pushing back because I don't like your attitude or your accent, or am I pushing back because I think what you're doing is a block to the group experience as a whole? And so, those learning objectives help me. They're good footing for pushing back.
That's great. Thanks.
Yeah, when you were saying the, like, I want people to have a good time is like the facilitator equivalent of wanting to be popular, I like both was like, yeah, and I was like, oh, like this like simultaneously like, oh, that's so true, and then this like reality gut check of like, how much do I do that? And that's so fascinating, right? Because I think that some people would be like, like Meg, you've been facilitating for like quite a long time at this point, you know, relative to maybe other people. How are you still not like keeping that in check? And I'm wondering, like, when you find yourself either like struggling with that, or even if there are other things that come to mind that you are like very actively still trying to check yourself about, that you see get in the way of your own like presence when being a facilitator. I'm just wondering if you want to be really vulnerable and just tell us all the things you're still working on.
Hello, Internet. These are things that I'm working on. I can be quippy, as you may have noticed in the last 22 minutes, but sometimes I laugh at that popularity aspect, because that is also a challenge for me. Like, it'd be hard pressed for me to come into a room and give a didactic training in which people look like they're having a terrible time. Or to really challenge people and have people like, what are we doing? So I value that group experience, and that's part of kind of empathy and being sensitive to the group's energy as a whole. One of my biggest challenges is sometimes I can distract myself because I'm trying to stay entertained and stay engaged. So I try to make a connection that's distant or tertiary or for me is interesting, and be like, whoa, and where'd I go there? Or tell a hilarious joke that is deadpan and nobody thinks is a joke or serious. They don't know what I'm talking about. Things like that I'm just doing to keep myself engaged, and sometimes I'm like, oh, that was a waste of energy.
Yeah. I had somebody once share, I can't remember the word, but it was a principle that they had learned from yoga, which was about like stealing time from other people. That like when you are in front of a room, like you can steal people's time by like not honoring that, by doing it for you instead of them. And that's just like, so what stood out to me was this idea that like when you're telling jokes to amuse yourself, you're like, ugh, I'm just doing this, and I'm just and I have the control here, so I'm stealing all y'all's time to amuse myself. And that's so challenging, and something I probably did this morning in the 3-hour workshop I just facilitated. I'm like, yep, I did that at least once. So
yeah. And the flip side is you got to find your passion in it. Like you've got to figure out what's fun for you and kind of own your own style and feel comfortable with that, and move forward. I think it's important to honor the group and also honor your angle as a facilitator, your unique style. I think when I started teaching, facilitating, leading those courses, I felt very, I felt like an imposter. I felt like I didn't quite belong there, because a lot of my mentors were these very type A analyst, architect, high executive functioning, strengths style, and very dialed in like that. And I'm not like that. And so it took me a while to find mentors in the field, or find my fun in it and feel like I fit. And so that's something that I would encourage people to do as well, is figure out what their strengths are and then develop those into talent, as opposed to trying to be a different type of facilitator.
Can you tell us about a time where you noticed that in yourself, like a time where you were in front of a training or gearing up for a training and something clicked with, I don't have to do this like that, I can do this like this?
Mm-hmm. Gosh, I'm trying to think if I had an aha moment. I think I worked with a number of people over a number of years that helped me find that strength. Working with NOLS, National Outdoor Leadership School, I was doing sea kayaking work, so leading sea kayaking expeditions in Southeast Alaska, and I had a friend and colleague who was just a couple of years older than me, and this really, really mellow Canadian guy from BC. And he knew his stuff. He was a good paddler. He was technically proficient. But in terms of process, he wasn't what you would put into your prototypical manager or leader. He seemed a little bit aloof. He moved kind of slow. He was just himself, and it was fun to see that colleague be successful and realize, okay, well, I'm different than him, but he's different than them. And so by the transitive property of equality, I think we can all be, NOLS instructors, right? So that was helpful, just to get exposure to different leadership styles, and that's a cool part about working for NOLS, in that you get to work alongside many different types of folks. I'm working tomorrow with a woman in Petzel who was my NOLS instructor in 1999, and she's still been working for the school 15 years later. And it's just fun to see, see all sorts of styles.
For sure. So many people, I think, get hung up on that same thing that you described, right? Of just seeing it one way and thinking that they have to aspire to that way. Yeah. I like that idea of noticing the person who was doing their own thing and doing it well. I don't know if I have a moment for myself either where that necessarily clicked. It's just something that I'm always trying to plot of other people, because the last thing I would ever want is for someone to think that they have to facilitate the way that I do, right? If I'm training facilitators, Meg and I talk about this a lot. Like, the last thing we want is for people to think that they have to emulate our style, but then that there's any one good way that's the right way. So I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say the transfer property, applying some formal logic to facilitation style. I'm on board.
Something that's been helpful in working with my student staff, student leaders, groups at large now is this Clifton Strengths Finder stuff. Have you played with that at all?
Mm-hmm.
I was skeptical at first, as I am of like any canned curriculum, but it's been a fun way to bring out just that diversity and talent and let people know that like leadership is any one of these quadrants. And so with NOLS, we had a class that was in quadrants: analyst, architect, which is executive functioning, driver, like analytical functioning. It has all these quadrants, and this breaks that down into a more specific talent. And I think that through that kind of the power of positive psychology, I guess, is what I would boil down to, is helping people find what they're really good at and then building that into talent.
Yeah, I think one thing that you said is like to see your unique abilities as abilities, right? Or your like propensities as abilities, and then I think you said like find your fun in that. I think that is something I do really appreciate about StrengthsFinder, is the idea that like there are so many things in that somebody could be like, oh, that's just this thing that I do and it doesn't have inherent value. And StrengthsFinder is framing it all as strengths, right? Or something you can develop into a strength, and that is a cool aspect to it. I see Sam wanting to.
Oh, I was going to say, it hits on that framework that you mentioned way earlier in the conversation about that y'all took from improv, that last step of use everything. I like the idea of just looking around, and anything that you bring to the table or anything that anybody else in the training or in the little community that you're forming brings, it can be useful. It's just a matter of how you use it.
Yeah, I think that the perspective that Strengths brings to teams is also really helpful for groups to move forward, in that I think when I started, or a lot of young leaders, teachers, facilitators start, we derive some of our power from this negative energy that is self-differentiation. And I think it's like a cultural cancer in some ways, of like, no, like that person's like that, and I'm more like this, that person's like that, and I'm different than that, so I'm better. And what Strengths encourages us to do is see talent in everyone and value in all these different styles. So it helps teams be like, oh, that person's, even though they're quiet, they're still okay. Or even though that person is maybe slow to make a decision, they're also bringing this value to our team. So it helps a team function almost more than I think it can be helpful for an individual.
I read about this framework recently, and I haven't dug into this yet, so maybe one of the two of you are familiar with it, but it's this idea of, in team dynamics, recognizing, sometimes we recognize or we label a trait as positive or negative, and that could be the same trait. Like, someone's loud, that could be positive or it could be negative. Somebody is quiet, that could be positive or negative, right? That's our mindset, or the way that we see a trait. And this framework is that if you are finding yourself labeling something as a negative, there's a good chance that that thing is a shadow of some positive trait that person has. Right. And if you're seeing something as negative, see that instead as a shadow of some positive that person brings to the group, because every positive will cast a shadow in some way. Any trait that you see as negative might be cast by something positive. And then the flip side is recognizing that oftentimes people's strengths will present shadows, right? So if somebody is very loud and talkative, that will create the shadow of other people in the group being silenced. So recognizing both the shadows and the positives that you see, and then also the positives and the shadows, I thought was a really interesting way to think about group dynamics.
Yeah, I like that kind of following the shadow into the light analogy of, if there's something that's bugging you and you're standing in that shadow, then where does that come from?
Yeah.
I haven't heard that before, but we do use the term shadow side to talk about managing our strengths, or triaging some of what would be called weaknesses, right? So how do we work with those? Which is typically it's interesting to present these strengths workshops, because people really want to get on. Well, what about my weaknesses? How do I get better at this? How do I, how can I be the best at everything? I think it's just fascinating. Minds work. Even if to tell a group of people that they can't be as good at everything as they try the same amount at, is kind of fascinating. You know, if you think about it, like, I don't know why I'm talking about math so much today, but it's a different thing, like an arithmetic increase and an exponential increase to multiply your talent times all the reps, or multiply something that maybe isn't in your top 10 talents. I just think it's fascinating how we really strive hard to manage these shadow sides, and I think it's easy to get sucked into as a facilitator. Is all of your weaknesses that we need to manage. So that's a big trap. Is that people could spend the whole lesson managing their weaknesses as opposed to stepping into their talents.
Yeah.
So I know we have to transition in a minute to, or we don't have to, but we're going to transition in a minute to some rapid fire questions. Okay. But I have like one more question that I want to throw out related to like the strengths and kind of the strengths conversation, which is, so on the book website that me and Sam have, one of the pages starts with the phrase like, "We believe facilitation can change the world." Mm-hmm. And I am presuming, / I think that I've asked you this and you had a yes answer, so like that you also believe that. And I want to know, like, if you, like, just how do you believe it can change the world, or like why do you believe facilitation can change the world? Either of those methods of answering, but that's something I would love to hear your thoughts on.
Yeah, we live in constant danger of assimilating our everyday experiences and our out-of-ordinary experiences into our existing worldviews, right? And that's problematic if everything that we experience is just reincorporated into our existing worldview as opposed to an opportunity to change the way that we see things. And so that's where I think good facilitation can change the world, is that it has the ability to break down some of these blinders for us and allow us to change worldviews, change perspectives, just by making space for those conversations to happen.
I think that's great. Meg, are you muted? I'm sorry about that. I don't know
what happened.
Okay, there you go. You're good. Oh, nope. Oh, well, here we go. Here's an opportunity for changing worldviews. Okay. I think that's great. And it hits, Eric, on what you were talking about way earlier, that idea of the flexibility. If everybody in the world could react and be more flexible in things, how much that would make things better. And I would like to jump into the rapid fire questions with, this isn't our first question, but it's related to that. It's, if you could apply one ground rule to the entire world for everybody in the world to follow, if there was one group norm or ground rule for everybody in the world to follow at all times, what would it be?
Reciprocity.
How would you describe that?
I don't know. It's just the first word that came to my mind. I was thinking like a ground rule of, I don't know, cheesy but golden rule. You know, treat others as they want to treat you. But really, I think the bigger aspect of that is try to see the why of where people are coming from. Try to see the energy behind people's intention. I don't know if you've ever seen the "This is Water." It's a commencement speech that's turned into a video. But that's what it made me think of, is like we are always kind of incorporating all these experiences into whatever current funk that we're in, and instead let's like take a time out and think about giving that energy back in a different way.
Great. If anybody hasn't seen that, the "This is Water" commencement address was by David Foster Wallace many years ago, but it's on YouTube. The whole thing, it's incredibly moving.
Yeah, I feel like there's going to be so many amazing links from this conversation, and that will be one of them. Okay, next question. What are 3 words that you would use to describe facilitation?
3 words that I would describe facilitation. Can I say make space to make meaning again? Space, place, and I don't know. Face. Look me in the face. Space, place, and intention.
Okay.
Yeah.
What is something that you still need to be reminded of as a facilitator?
I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and doggone it, people like me. I think that I try to remind myself frequently that we all enter that space from very different places. right? So you and Meg and I could all have the same experience, but based on where we've come from and what we've lived through, it's going to be a very different experience. And so I remind myself of that when I'm kind of facilitating and wondering what's going on in that group, feeling like I don't have that pulse on the group, and then need to remind myself of that to pause and inquire and draw those other experiences in so I can kind of collect more information for the group.
Great.
What stresses you out as a facilitator?
We were joking at the beginning of this, technology. If my dongle doesn't work, trying to plug into the computer, like throwing my computer aside. That stresses me out. Technology can stress me out when things don't go according to plan. I think, yeah, holidays.
If anybody doesn't know what a dongle is, we will also link to that in the description.
Yeah. There's a name for that condition. It's ED, enigmatic dongle, I think is what we refer to that as in the field. There are pills you can take. They may not help. Okay. What is a piece of facilitation advice you'd give your 5-year-ago self?
5-year-ago self. No. You got this. You can do it. Be yourself. Trust the process. Outcomes will be okay.
Great. This is something I'm very excited for you to answer. What is a unique place that you have facilitated?
I was just in Singapore, working with Singapore Outward Bound, focusing on Leave No Trace Master Educator training. So it's a tiny urban island, and we're talking about how to camp with no impact in a place that isn't filled with wilderness. It's pretty spectacular.
You know what's funny is that question. I think that the most honest way for you to answer it, Eric, would have been like in a classroom, because everywhere I facilitate is some ridiculous, amazing. Like the beginning of that sentence is so great. A odd space for you would be like a classroom with no windows, which is where I live, basically.
My second answer would be a California Pizza Kitchen courtyard in the Tucson Mall.
Oh,
yeah, I think that's probably the toughest facilitation space I've had.
All right. Cool. What is a not directly facilitation-related experience that you think every facilitator should have?
No. Building a house. For me, I approach facilitation as like intellectual blue-collar work, and so I think that hard labor is kind of essential for me to unwind and think about the way that I exist in this other space. I can be pretty extroverted, and so I think it's important for us to like step out of our disciplines and see how some of the principles of our work could apply in real-world analogies. You know, it doesn't have to be a house. It could be a gym. It could be a bike. But thinking about systems and interconnectivity and cause and effect relationships and those things like that, they can be kind of therapeutic for me as I unwind from other worlds.
Great.
Awesome. This is where I bite my tongue and don't ask you a bunch of follow-up questions about what you just said. Okay. What book or books do you recommend most to other people?
I'm reading now The War of Art.
Ooh, yeah.
Which is pretty cool. A friend of mine from the journalism school turned me on to that, and it's just been a fun read. I also have read a Jack Reacher novel recently, and it's terrible and amazing. Yeah. Kind of like
War of Art's by Stephen Pressfield.
Any like? Oh, go ahead, Sam.
I was just going to say, yeah, I mean, it's an easy book to find, and it's definitely a good and...
It's fun. I especially resonated with this idea of a resistance. You know, the whole first part of the book is about resistance and the stories that we tell ourselves that keep us from telling our stories. And I think that would be my advice to myself 5 years ago, is like, don't let resistance take over. Like, everybody has a story to tell, and yours is unique, so go for it, you know.
Great. We've got one more question. This is your call to action for anybody who's listening or anybody who watches this video. What would you ask of them, or what advice do you have for them?
I'm curious as to who they are. I don't really feel like I know anything definitively, so I'm always interested in learning from everyone. So if you're listening, send me a Twitter message, send me an email. Let's talk about this stuff. This is kind of a fun thing to do on a Monday morning. I think it's pretty rare that we get to actually have these conversations about the work that we live in in such a dedicated and fun way. So I appreciate you all doing this. I would also call out any of my colleagues who may have clicked on this to write you all, and I have a lot of good people to interview for you. I think there's some fun conversations to be had.
Cool. Oh man, so excited about that. So are there any, like, so we have a ton of links to put to like share with folks. Is there any like online resources or any like places or things you want to like make sure people are connected to, or things you find particularly useful as a facilitator that you just want to like throw out there to the live audience and share?
Gosh, I swear by the NOLS Leadership Education Notebook, the LEN. Mine is somewhere in this office. Oh, here it is. I don't know if this is like a testament to like my usage or just the terrible places that I've taken it, but this one has a lot of dog-eared pages, and it's not just about being wildernessy and adventure. It's like communication wheels, impact versus intent, feedback sandwiches. It's a really good thing, and all of it's turnkey, so you can read it and use it the next day. That's my favorite one. Yeah.
And then places where people can find you online beyond Twitter, if you want to share like your email address or website or anything along those lines.
My email address is my full name, Eric, Boggs, B-O-G-G-S, @gmail.com. I have a website that's kind of a creative project that's called expeditionlead.com, which rotates projects. It used to be leadership lessons from airplane safety cards. Right now I think it's risk management lessons from Baja road signs. So eventually I'll have a bunch more projects on there, but it kind of plays with metaphors a bit. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Eric, this has been a blast, and I'm so glad that we got to connect and to like dig into so much good things. There are so many like just even quotes from this conversation that I'm like just holding on to / full of paper to document. So I just want to say thanks so much for hanging out with us.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks. I think we'd have this figured out by now. Thanks for the invite. It's fun talking with you, Sam. It's nice to meet you. I hope to stay connected and be able to reconnect. Maybe AEE, Minnesota, this fall.
Yep, I'll be there.
Cool.
Take care, and thanks for everybody who tuned in. This will hopefully be up on YouTube soon, and we'll have another interview or another edition of this for you soon. Right, Meg? When's the next one?
July 7th.
July 7th. Okay, cool. So not super soon, but soon enough. All right, take care.
All right, thanks, y'all.